My manager called me into his office. "You're being let go. Budget cuts." I'd worked there 15 years. I cleaned my desk. Then I walked to HR and filed my whistleblower complaint. He was arrested 3 days later for embezzlement. The meeting invitation appeared on my Outlook calendar at $4:15 p.m. on a Thursday, blinking with the innocuous subject line, "Structural Realignment, Role Update," a corporate euphemism that every veteran in the logistics industry knows translates directly to termination. I stared at its screen for exactly 30 seconds, watching the cursor pulse next to the name of the sender. Simon Sterling, the regional vice president of operations, a man who had been my direct superior for 18 months, and who wore three-piece Italian suits that cost more than my first car. I did not panic. I did not feel the cold sweat of anxiety that usually accompanies the realization that your livelihood is about to be severed. Instead, I felt a strange, crystalline sense of relief, the kind of calm that settles over a structural engineer when they finally identify the microscopic fracture that threatens to bring down the bridge. I checked the time of the meeting. $9, a.m. Friday, October, $14, diets. I had been the senior logistics analyst for Apex Global Solutions for 15 years, 3 months, and 12 days. I had built the legacy tracking system, a complex mesh of SQL databases and custom algorithms that monitored freight movements across 3 continents. I knew where every shipping container was, from the port of Shenzhen to the rail yards of Chicago, and, more importantly, I knew where the money wasn't. I spent the rest of that Thursday afternoon doing exactly what I had done every day for a decade and a half. I generated the daily variance reports, I approved the fuel surcharge reconciliations for the trucking fleet, and I backed up my personal drive, a specifically encrypted partition on the server that Simon didn't know existed, to an external solid-state drive that I kept in the false bottom of my leather satchel. When I left the office at $6 p.m., I said goodnight to the security guard, a 60-year-old man named Ralph who had worked the front desk for 12 years, and I walked to my car with the steady, measured pace of a man who has already read the last page of the book and knows exactly how the villain dies. To understand why I didn't panic, you have to understand the ecosystem of Apex Global Solutions before Simon Sterling arrived. We were a boring, profitable company. We moved auto parts and industrial textiles. The margins were thin, typically $12, percent dollar to $15, percent dollar, but the volume was massive. My job was efficiency. I hunted for pennies. If a container sat in a demurrage yard for 4 hours longer than necessary, I knew about it. If a route variance added 12 miles to a delivery, I flagged it. I reported to Old Man Henderson, the previous VP, a guy who wore short-sleeved dress shirts and ate a tuna sandwich at his desk every day. Then Henderson retired, and corporate sent us Simon Sterling. Simon was 38, held an MBA from a mid-tier university that he talked about as if it were Harvard, and spoke exclusively in buzzwords. He talked about synergy, disruptive logistics, and lean optimization. Within 3 months, he had remodeled the executive suite, installing a $12,000 espresso bar, and replacing the ergonomic office chairs with sleek, uncomfortable modernist furniture. He also changed the vendor approval process. Previously, any new vendor required 3 layers of sign-off: mine, the finance directors, and the VPs. Simon streamlined it. "We need agility," he announced in a town hall meeting, his teeth gleaming white against his spray tan. "Mark, your old systems are dinosaurs. We're moving to a rapid approval matrix." The rapid approval matrix meant that any contract under $50,000 could be approved solely by the VP. At the time, I just nodded. I was the dinosaur. He was the asteroid. But dinosaurs have one advantage. We have been around long enough to notice when the weather changes. The first anomaly appeared 4 months into Simon's tenure, on November $12th. I was running a routine audit of the domestic freight accounts. I noticed a payment of $9,850 to a vendor listed as North Star Consultative Logistics. The invoice code was flagged as expedited route planning. I knew every route planner in the tri-state area. I had never heard of North Star. I pulled the metadata on the invoice. It had been submitted at $11:42 p.m. on a Sunday and approved at $11:44 p.m. by Simon Sterling. 2 minutes. No supporting documentation, no bill of lading, just a PDF invoice that looked like it had been generated from a generic Microsoft Word template. I didn't say anything. I simply created a new folder on my encrypted drive and named it Anomaly Log. In my line of work, you don't make accusations. You aggregate data points. 1 data point is a mistake. 3 is a pattern. 10 is a strategy. Over the next 6 months, North Star Consultative Logistics billed us 24 times. The amounts were always specific. Jagged numbers designed to look organic. $14,230.50, $8,995.22, $11,400. They never exceeded the $15,000 internal audit trigger for the quarterly review, but the aggregate was growing. By May, North Star had been paid $214,000. I decided to dig deeper. I used my lunch break to run a background check on the business entity. It was an LLC registered in Delaware, using a registered agent service that masked the actual ownership. Standard practice for legitimate companies, but also standard practice for shell companies. However, the invoices had a remit to address in a commercial park in Newark, New Jersey. On a Saturday morning, I drove out there. I told my wife Ellen that I was going to look at a used boat, a lie that hurt because we had always talked about buying a boat when I retired. I parked my sedan across the street from the address listed on the invoice. $450 Industrial Way, Suite $404. It wasn't a logistics consulting firm. It was a mail drop store, a pack and ship, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a failing vape shop. I took a photo of the storefront with my phone, the timestamp reading $10, $14 a.m. I watched for an hour. No consultants came or went, just people mailing packages. I drove home, the cold knot of realization tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just incompetence, it was embezzlement. But $214,000 was small potatoes for a company with revenue in the hundreds of millions. I needed to know the endgame. The escalation began in July. Simon announced a vendor consolidation initiative. He fired 3 of our long-standing trucking partners, legitimate family-owned businesses we had worked with for a decade, claiming their rates were non-competitive. He replaced them with a single entity, Apex Prime Logistics. The name was clever. It sounded like an internal subsidiary, but it wasn't. It was an external vendor. The rates they quoted were indeed $10 lower than our previous carriers. On paper, Simon looked like a genius. He was saving the company money. But I looked at the service logs. Apex Prime Logistics didn't own any trucks. They were a brokerage. They were taking our shipments and subcontracting them out to cheap, unverified owner-operators, often without proper insurance. But here was the kicker, the brokerage fees. Apex Prime was charging a $25% management fee on top of the freight costs, burying it in the fuel and accessorials line item of the ledger. I ran the numbers. The $10% savings on the rate was obliterated by the $25% fee. The company was actually paying $15% asterisk more times for shipping. But because of how the budget lines were coded freight versus administrative fees, Simon's freight budget looked lean, while the administrative overhead bloated. And who approved the invoices for Apex Prime? Simon Sterling. The registered address for Apex Prime? A virtual office in a high-rise in Miami. The registered agent? The same one used by North Star. By September, the total drain on the company was approaching $2.4 million. I needed verification. I needed a validator. I reached out to Elias Thorne, an old friend from college who had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant for the FBI before going private. We met at a diner 20 miles outside of town, a place with vinyl booths and bad coffee, far away from the prying eyes of the corporate district. I slid a USB drive across the table to him. It contained a clone of the anomaly log, now grown to $400 megabytes of PDFs, spreadsheets, and photos. Tell me I'm crazy, Elias, I said. Tell me this is just creative accounting. Elias spent 3 days with the data. When he called me back, his voice was flat, the voice of a man who has seen everything. You're not crazy, Mark. You're sitting on a powder keg. It's a classic pass-through scheme. North Star is the test balloon. Apex Prime is the main engine. He's skimming roughly $18% of every transaction. But he's getting sloppy. I found a metadata tag in one of the Excel invoices from Apex Prime. The author field wasn't scrubbed. It says, S. Sterling, home. He's generating these invoices on his personal laptop. How much? I asked. Projected loss is $4.2 million over 18 months, Elias said. But Mark, be careful. A guy stealing $4 million isn't going to stop because you ask nicely. If he knows you know, you're a liability. I knew I was a liability. That's why I hadn't said a word. I continued to do my job, nodding at Simon's presentations, clapping when he showed the slide deck with the savings graph that I knew was a fabrication. But the stress was wearing on me. I started double-checking everything, and that was my mistake. On October $10, 4 days before the meeting, I had sent a query to the accounts payable manager, a woman named Janice, who was fiercely loyal to Simon. I asked a simple question. Janice, can you pull the insurance certificates for the carriers used by Apex Prime? I have a compliance audit coming up. It was a standard request, but Janice must have told Simon. 2 hours later, my access to the vendor master file was temporarily suspended for IT maintenance. 2 days later, the meeting invite arrived. He knew. He was cutting the cord before I could pull the plug. So, Friday morning, $8, $55 a.m., I walked into the office. I was wearing my best suit, a navy blue wool blend that was 5 years old but immaculately pressed. I carried nothing but a notepad and a pen. I left my phone at my desk, recording the room audio. I walked down the hallway to the corner office. Simon's assistant, a young woman named Chloe, who looked terrified most of the time, wouldn't meet my eyes. He's expecting you, Mark, she whispered. I knocked and entered. Simon was standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline, a pose he had undoubtedly practiced in a mirror. He turned, his face arranged in a mask of somber regret. Mark, have a seat, he said, gesturing to one of the uncomfortable modernist chairs. I sat. I kept my back straight, my hands folded on my lap. This is a hard conversation, Mark, he began, his voice dropping to a theatrical baritone. We've been reviewing the Q3 numbers. The market headwinds are significant. Corporate is demanding we run leaner. We have to make some structural changes to the logistics division. He paused, waiting for me to beg, to ask if there was another role, to show weakness. I just looked at him, studying the way his expensive watch caught the light. I understand, I said calmly. He blinked, thrown off by my lack of reaction. We're eliminating the senior analyst position effective immediately, he said, speeding up. This is purely a budgetary decision. It's not a reflection of your 15 years of service. We're offering a severance package, 4 weeks of pay, plus COBRA coverage for 2 months. It's generous, considering the circumstances. 4 weeks, after 15 years. It was an insult designed to provoke a reaction, to make me storm out, to make me look unstable. Budget cuts, I repeated slowly. That's interesting, Simon, considering the freight volume is up $22% dollar year over year. Simon's eyes narrowed. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the predator underneath. Volume doesn't equal margin, Mark. You know that. We need to modernize your role. It's redundant. We have algorithms that do what you do now. Algorithms provided by North Star Consultative Logistics? I asked. The air in the room instantly vanished. Simon went deadly still. His face, usually flushed with confidence, went the color of parchment. Excuse me, he said, his voice tight. Or perhaps Apex Prime, I continued, my voice level, conversational. I was just wondering if the algorithms are generated at the registered address in Newark, or if they come from the laptop labeled Sterling Home. Simon stood up slowly. He leaned over the desk, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. I don't know what you think you're doing, he hissed, but if you breathe a word of your paranoid delusions to anyone, I will bury you. I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I have the board's ear. Who are you? You're a spreadsheet jockey. Take the severance. Sign the NDA. Get out. I stood up. I didn't shake his hand. I'll take the paperwork, Simon, but I won't be signing the NDA today. I need to review it with my counsel. I picked up the folder he had pushed across the desk. You have until noon to clear your desk, he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Security will escort you out. That won't be necessary, I said. I'm a professional. I walked out of his office, past Chloe, down the long corridor to my cubicle. I could feel Simon's eyes boring into my back. He thought he had won. He thought he had intimidated me. He thought the threat of professional ruin would silence me. He didn't understand that I wasn't playing for a job anymore. I was playing for the truth. I returned to my desk. It was $9, $14 a.m. I spent exactly 45 minutes packing my personal effects. A framed photo of Ellen and the kids, my lucky stapler, a coffee mug that said, World's Okayest Analyst. I left the files. I left the computer. I knew that IT would be scrubbing the drive within the hour. It didn't matter. The external drive in my satchel held everything. The $2,400 pages of invoices, the metadata analysis from Elias, the photos of the mail drop storefront, and the audio recording of the meeting I had just left, which was currently syncing to the cloud via my phone. At $10, $0 a.m., Ralph, the security guard, appeared at my desk, looking apologetic. I'm sorry, Mark, he said, looking at his shoes. Mr. Sterling called down, said I have to walk you out. It's okay, Ralph, I said, smiling at him. You're just doing your job. Actually, can you walk me to the elevator? I need to stop by the 4th floor on my way out. Ralph frowned. The parking garage is in the basement, Mark. I know, I said, but I have one last stop. HR is on the 4th floor. I need to drop off my badge. Ralph hesitated, then nodded. Sure, Mark, sure. We took the elevator up. The doors opened on the 4th floor, the domain of human resources. I walked past the reception desk, straight to the office of Sarah Jenkins, the vice president of HR. Sarah was a tough woman, a stickler for protocol, the kind of person who terrified Simon because she reported directly to the global board of directors, not the regional VP. Her door was open. She looked up, surprised to see me with a box in my hands. Mark? She asked. I saw the email. Structural realignment? I set my box down on the chair outside her office. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a thick, spiral-bound document I had printed at Kinko's at $6, $0 a.m. that morning. The cover page read, Formal Whistleblower Complaint Regarding Systematic Embezzlement and Fiduciary Fraud by Simon Sterling, submitted by Mark D. Reynolds. I'm not here to discuss my severance, Sarah, I said, stepping into her office and closing the door behind me. I'm here to report a crime, and under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, you are legally required to hear me out before I leave this building. Sarah looked at the document, then at me. She saw the calm in my eyes. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. Cancel my meetings, she said, never breaking eye contact with me. All of them. And get legal on the line. Now, I sat down. Phase 1 was complete. Simon thought he had fired a redundant employee. He had just locked himself in a cage with a lion. The door to Sarah Jenkins' office clicked shut, sealing us in a bubble of pressurized silence that felt heavy enough to crush bone. I sat across from her, my hands resting on the spiral-bound report, while she stared at the cover page as if it were a bomb that had just ticked down to 0. Simon Sterling, she repeated, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Mark, you know what you're alleging here. This isn't just a policy violation. This is felony fraud. If you are wrong, if this is just bitterness over the termination, the company will destroy you. I can't protect you from a defamation suit. I didn't blink. I opened the report to page $14, a spreadsheet comparing the invoice dates of North Star Consultative Logistics with Simon's Outlook calendar, which I had legally accessed through the shared administrative view prior to my access being cut. I'm not wrong, Sarah, and I'm not bitter. I'm accurate. Look at the timestamps. Every single invoice from North Star was approved within 3 minutes of submission, always late at night or on weekends. Now, look at page $22. This is the metadata from the PDF invoice, dated August $14.th. The author tag is Cess, Sterling, Home. The software license key used to generate the PDF matches the Microsoft Office license registered to his company-issued laptop. He's not just approving the invoices, he's writing them. Sarah's eyes widened as she traced the lines of data. She picked up her desk phone again, her hand trembling slightly. Get Robert Vance down here, immediately. Tell him we have a code red on the executive floor. Robert Vance was the general counsel for Apex Global, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and dressed in a $5,000 suit. He arrived 3 minutes later, carrying a legal pad and an expression of extreme skepticism. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, looking down at me. Mr. Reynolds, he said, his voice a low rumble. I understand you've just been let go. It's a stressful time. Often, employees feel the need to lash out. I didn't let him finish the standard corporate gaslighting script. Mr. Vance, I interrupted, my voice calm, level, and devoid of emotion. I am not a disgruntled employee lashing out. I am a shareholder and a whistleblower, protected under federal law. I have already uploaded a mirror of this evidence to a secure cloud server with a dead man switch. If I am escorted out of this building without a formal investigation being opened, the data goes to the SEC and the FBI automatically in 24 hours. I suggest you sit down and look at Exhibit D, the shell company structure. Vance paused, his eyes narrowing. He assessed me, realized I was not bluffing, and pulled out a chair. For the next 2 hours, the room was silent, except for the turning of pages and the sharp intake of breath from Sarah as the scope of the theft became clear. When we got to the Apex Prime section, the kickback scheme involving the freight brokerage, Vance stopped reading. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. $2.4 million, he whispered, in 6 months. Total exposure is likely over $4 million if you audit the fuel surcharges, I corrected. I stopped counting at $2.4 million because I ran out of access. Vance looked at me, his skepticism replaced by the cold, hard stare of a prosecutor. Stay here, he ordered. I need to make a call to the chairman of the audit committee. Sarah, lock Simon's access. Do it quietly. Don't revoke his login, just mirror his keystrokes and prevent any external data transfers. We don't want him to know we know. Not yet. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of suspended animation. They didn't send me home. Instead, they moved me to a secure conference room in the legal department, a windowless bunker on the $12th floor. I was given a laptop with restricted access and asked to walk a team of 3 external forensic auditors through my methodology. These weren't the standard corporate auditors. These were specialists from a firm called BlackRock Forensics, men and women who wore tactical pants and spoke in code. My validator, Elias Thorne, was brought in as a consultant on Saturday morning to verify the integrity of the data I had extracted. He greeted me with a grim nod. You did good, Mark, he said, examining the server logs. You left breadcrumbs, but you didn't touch the original files. Chain of custody is intact. We worked through the weekend, surviving on stale bagels and lukewarm coffee. The building was empty, a ghost ship of commerce, but on the executive floor, the digital surveillance was active. We watched on a monitor as Simon Sterling logged in from his home on Saturday night. We saw him open the Apex Prime invoice template. We saw him adjust a figure from $12,500 to $14,800. We saw him save it as a PDF and email it to his work account. He was stealing in real time, completely unaware that 5 people were watching him do it from a conference room 10 miles away. Robert Vance stood behind us, watching the screen. He's getting greedy, Vance muttered. He thinks he's clear because he fired you. He thinks the watchdog is gone. He's not just greedy, I said, pointing to the screen. He's desperate. Look at his browser history. He's on a gambling site. High-stakes poker. He's down $85,000 this week alone. He needs that invoice to clear by Monday to cover his margin call. It was the final piece of the psychological puzzle. Simon wasn't just a thief, he was an addict. The structural realignment wasn't about the company's budget, it was about his own failing liquidity. By Sunday night, the case was airtight. We had the invoices, the IP addresses, the gambling debts, and the direct link to the shell companies. The FBI had been contacted. A special agent named Miller, a man with a buzz cut and a suit that looked like it concealed a shoulder holster, arrived at $0 p.m. to review the package. He spent an hour with the data, asking me specific technical questions about the accounting software. At the end, he closed the folder. This is actionable, Miller said. We have probable cause for wire fraud, embezzlement, and potentially money laundering. We'll move on him tomorrow. Vance looked at me. Mark, we need you to be here tomorrow morning. Not in the conference room, in the town hall meeting. I looked up, surprised. The town hall? He fired me. Technically, Vance said, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. The termination paperwork was never countersigned by HR. Sarah froze it in the queue. you. You are still an employee of Apex Global Solutions. And Simon has called an emergency all-hands meeting for $9:00 a.m. to discuss the new direction of the department. We want him to feel safe. We want him to be in the middle of his victory lap when the wall comes down. Monday morning, October 17, $th. The atmosphere in the main auditorium was tense. Rumors of my firing had spread, and the logistics team, my team, looked demoralized. They sat in clumps, whispering, looking at the empty stage. I waited in the wings, behind the heavy velvet curtain, standing next to Agent Miller and two uniformed officers. My heart was beating a steady, rhythmic tattoo against my ribs, $72 beats per minute. I checked my watch, $8, $59 a.m. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the spotlight hit the center stage. Simon Sterling walked out. He looked immaculate. His suit was a sharp charcoal gray, his tie a bold crimson. He fairly bounced to the podium, energized by the adrenaline of his survival. He adjusted the microphone, flashing that practiced, shark-like smile. "Good morning, team," he boomed, his voice projecting confidence. "I know there have been some rumors. I know change is hard, but I want to assure you that the decisions made last week were necessary for the survival of this company. We are trimming the fat. We are moving away from the antiquated systems of the past and embracing a future of agility and speed." He paused for effect, scanning the room. "Mark Reynolds was a good man," he said, the past tense hanging in the air like a tombstone. "But his vision no longer aligned with where we are going. We need leaders who are willing to take risks, to innovate, to push the boundaries of what is possible." I listened to him rewrite my history, turning my 15 years of competence into a narrative of obsolescence. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He was using my departure to terrify the remaining staff into submission. "I am excited to announce," Simon continued, "that we have secured a new strategic partnership with a logistics consultancy that will revolutionize our supply chain. They are called North Star, and under their guidance," Agent Miller tapped me on the shoulder. "It's time," he whispered. I didn't step out. Not yet. I watched as Robert Vance walked onto the stage from the opposite side. Simon stopped mid-sentence, annoyed. "Robert," he said into the mic, "I'm in the middle of a presentation." Robert Vance didn't have a microphone, but his voice carried clearly in the silent room. "Simon, I need you to step away from the podium." "This can wait, Robert," Simon snapped, his arrogance overriding his survival instinct. "No, it can't," Vance said, stopping 5 feet from him. "This meeting is over, and so is your tenure." Simon laughed, a nervous, incredulous sound. "Excuse me? I am the regional VP. You can't interrupt me like this." That was the cue. I stepped out from behind the curtain. The gasp from the audience was audible, a collective intake of breath from 300 people. Simon froze. He looked at me, then at Vance, then back at me. His face went slack, the color draining away instantly. "Mark," he whispered, the microphone picking up the tremble in his voice. I fired you." I walked to the center of the stage, standing next to Vance. I looked out at the audience, at the faces of the people I had worked with for a decade. Then I turned to Simon. "You tried, Simon," I said, my voice projecting without a microphone, steady and cold. "But you forgot one thing. You can fire the analyst, but you can't delete the data. We know about North Star. We know about Apex Prime. We know about the gambling debts. And we know about the $4.2 million. Simon stumbled back, knocking over his water glass. This is insane. "Security, get him out of here." "Security isn't coming for me, Simon," I said. "They're here for you." Agent Miller and the two officers stepped out from the wings. The visual impact was devastating. The crisp suits of the FBI agents contrasted sharply with Simon's panicked, crumbling facade. Miller walked up to the podium, flashed his badge, and spoke the words that every white-collar criminal dreads. "Simon Sterling, I am Special Agent Miller with the FBI. You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft." The officers moved in. They didn't do it gently. They pulled Simon's hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the auditorium, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the stunned silence. Simon began to struggle, his veneer of sophistication dissolving into primal fear. "You can't do this." "Do you know who I am? I have rights." "Mark, tell them. This is a misunderstanding." As they marched him across the stage, past the very people he had threatened to fire, he locked eyes with me one last time. He looked for mercy. He looked for a gloat. He found neither. He found only the impassive face of a man who had done the math. "It's not a misunderstanding, Simon," I said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "It's a variance report, and you've been reconciled." They led him out the side door. The heavy metal exit door slammed shut, and the sound was like a gunshot. The room was absolutely silent for 5 seconds. Then, a single person started clapping. It was Janice, the accounts payable manager who had unwittingly helped him. Then another. Then the whole room erupted. It wasn't a cheer of joy. It was a release of tension, a collective exhale of a workforce that had been living under a guillotine. Robert Vance stepped to the microphone. "Everyone, please settle down," he said, his voice regaining its corporate calm. "There will be a full investigation. Operations will continue as normal. And Mark Reynolds has been reinstated as the acting director of logistics, effective immediately. He will be leading the audit to recover the stolen funds." The days immediately following the arrest were a blur of procedural cleanup. My office, the one I had packed up on Friday, was restored, but I didn't move back in immediately. I spent the next week in the war room with the forensic accountants. The scope of Simon's fraud was even larger than we had thought. He hadn't just stolen from the company, he had stolen from the employees. We found a sub-scheme where he had been skimming from the 401k matching fund pool, diverting fractions of percentages into a holding account. It was the kind of detail that turned the staff's confusion into white-hot rage. I became the focal point of that rage, not as a target, but as a conduit. People stopped me in the hallways to thank me. They brought me coffee. They treated me like a folk hero, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a janitor cleaning up a toxic spill. I saw the wreckage of Simon's life laid out in spreadsheets. The mortgage payments he had missed, the tuition for his kids' private schools that was paid with stolen money, the desperate emails to loan sharks. He was a monster, yes, but a banal one. He was a man who wanted more than he earned and thought he was smarter than the system. On Thursday, 3 days after the arrest, I was subpoenaed to testify at his bail hearing. I sat in the front row of the federal courthouse. Simon was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking small and shrunken without his tailored suit. His wife was there, sitting 2 rows behind me, weeping into a handkerchief. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion. She didn't know. She thought I was the villain who had ruined her life. I held her gaze for a second, then looked away. I wasn't the villain. I was just the inevitable consequence. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the sheer volume of the evidence. As they led Simon away, he didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. The narcissist had been stripped of his mirror. I returned to the office that afternoon. The interim CEO, a woman named Eleanor Davis, who had been flown in from headquarters, called me into the executive suite. "Mark," she said, motioning to the chair, the same chair where Simon had fired me. "We owe you a debt. You saved the company millions, but more importantly, you saved our reputation. If this had come out in an external audit, our stock would have tanked. Because we caught it internally, because times you times caught it, we control the narrative." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It wasn't a severance package. It was a contract. "Director of Global Operations," she said, "a $60,000 raise, a seat on the ethics committee, and full autonomy to rebuild the department your way." I looked at the contract. The numbers were precise. The title was what I had worked 15 years for. But as I picked up the pen, I hesitated. I looked at the window where Simon had stood. I realized that the victory wasn't in the promotion. The victory was in the fact that I didn't need times the promotion to know my value anymore. I signed it, not with excitement, but with a sense of duty. "I'll take the job," I said, "but I have one condition. The vendor approval process goes back to 3 signatures. No exceptions." Eleanor smiled. "Agreed." The aftermath dragged on for months, a slow grind of depositions and asset seizures. The discovery phase had been fast and adrenaline-fueled. The aftermath was slow and bureaucratic. I testified before a grand jury. I walked the FBI through the server architecture. I watched as they auctioned off Simon's car, his boat, his house. It was a dismantling of a life, piece by piece. The witnesses, the vendors, the truckers, the staff, all gave their statements. The narrative solidified. Simon was the predator, I was the protector. But the most difficult part wasn't the legal battle, it was the personal toll. I found myself checking my own bank accounts obsessively, paranoid that I might have missed a decimal point, terrified that I could somehow slip into the same abyss of greed. I had to remind myself that integrity isn't a state of being, it's a daily practice. 6 months later, the trial began. It was a short affair. The evidence was overwhelming. Simon's lawyer tried to argue that he was under extreme duress due to his gambling addiction, painting him as a victim of a disease. It was a Hail Mary defense. I took the stand on the 3rd day. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named D.A. Reynolds, no relation, asked me a simple question. "Mr. Reynolds, when did you first suspect Mr. Sterling was embezzling funds?" I leaned into the microphone. "November $12 I said, at $11, $42 p.m. "And why didn't you report it then?" she asked. "Because suspicion isn't proof," I answered. "And in my line of work, you don't guess, you verify." The jury nodded. They understood. I wasn't emotional. I was the baseline. I was the control group. Simon watched me from the defense table, his eyes dead. He knew it was over. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. $12 counts of wire fraud. $4 counts of money laundering. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 months later. That night, after the verdict, I went to the dive bar near the rail yard where the old-timers used to hang out. It was empty except for the bartender. I ordered a beer and sat in the back. I pulled out my phone and deleted the anomaly log from my cloud drive. It was done. I didn't need to carry it anymore. But as I sat there, the door opened and someone walked in. It wasn't a colleague. It was Simon's wife. She looked tired, worn down by the public humiliation. She saw me and stopped. I tensed, expecting a scene. She walked over to my table. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice shaking. I wanted to ask you something." I put my beer down. "Mrs. Sterling, I don't think we should talk." "Did he?" she started, then stopped, tears welling up. "Did he ever talk about us? In the emails? In the files?" I looked at her, this woman who had lost everything because of her husband's greed. I knew the answer. I had read every email. Simon had never mentioned his family. He had only mentioned his debts and his desires. But I looked at her, and I decided that the truth truth had done enough damage. He wanted to pay off the house. I lied, my voice steady. He was trying to get out of debt for you. It doesn't excuse what he did, but that's what the files said. She let out a sob, a sound of relief and grief mixed together. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. She turned and left. I sat there, looking at my hands. I had spent a year dealing in hard facts, in cold numbers. But in that moment, I realized that sometimes the only way to close the ledger is with a small, merciful act of fiction. The 2 months between the guilty verdict and Simon Sterling's sentencing were marked by an intense, almost surgical cleansing of the operations division. I hadn't just been promoted to director of global operations. I was tasked with restoring the integrity of a system that had been compromised at the executive level. The atmosphere in the office had shifted entirely. The fear was gone, replaced by a cautious, collaborative energy. People wanted to trust the system again. My former team, the logistics analysts and inventory controllers who had been operating under Simon's oppressive regime, rallied around me. They trusted me because they knew I was the one who had spent 15 years in the trenches, hunting for pennies, and they knew I hadn't filed the whistleblower complaint for money, but for the principle. I made a point of empowering them. I reinstated the old, robust 3-signature vendor approval process, but I added a critical layer. Every single expenditure over $5,000 now required random peer review by 2 other department heads, effectively distributing the power and preventing any single point of failure. The total cost of the fraud, calculated by the FBI and verified by Apex Global's internal audit, stood at $4,312,900.55. The company recovered $2.1 million through the seizure of Simon's assets and the sale of his fraudulently purchased brokerage accounts. The remainder was considered a loss, a painful tuition fee for the company on the cost of unchecked arrogance. On the day of the sentencing, I did not attend. I delegated that task to Robert Vance, the general counsel, who needed to present the company's victim impact statement. Instead, I spent the morning in the data center, physically overseeing the decommissioning of the server rack that had hosted Simon's fraudulent brokerage account. I wanted to see the final material end of the problem I had spent a year solving. At $1:00 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Vance. 55 months, federal penitentiary, minimum security, restitution, $4.3 million, no parole before 85% served, justice delivered. $55 months, nearly 5 years, a harsh sentence designed to be a deterrent to other white-collar thieves. I looked at the dark, silent server rack, no longer humming with the electricity of deceit, and I felt nothing. No elation, no pity, just the quiet acknowledgement of a predictable outcome. Simon had set up an equation, and the court had simply solved for $x. The years that followed became the true resolution phase. My promotion and successful tenure as director of global operations cemented my position not just as an executive, but as an indispensable figure of authority and integrity within the corporation. I instituted a new company-wide ethics training module that used the Simon Sterling case, stripped of personal detail, of course, as its core example. The irony was sweet. The man who tried to fire me for being antiquated became the $4.3 million case study for why my methodical approach was essential. My life outside the office had found a rhythm I hadn't realized I desperately needed. I was 58 years old, the single father of 2 teenagers, Lily and Ethan, who were thriving. The house, the home I had worked 15 years for, was a haven of quiet stability. We ate dinner together every night at $7:00 p.m., a ritual I enforced religiously. I went to all of Lily's debates and Ethan's robotics competitions. The concept of showing up became the core principle of my life, a direct contrast to the way Simon had simply shown up to take. The memory of the ordeal faded into a distant, almost third-person account, something I had read in a business journal. But there was one piece of unfinished business, a thread that connected me to the emotional cost of the experience. Ellen. My wife, Ellen, had been collateral damage in my initial need for absolute secrecy. I had told her I was working on a large, confidential infrastructure project, using the professional jargon of my industry to mask the personal devastation. I hadn't been physically unfaithful, but I had been emotionally absent, building my case in a vault of silence. We survived the stress of the job loss scare and the immediate aftermath of the arrest, but the deception created a chasm between us. She sensed my secret life, the cold calculation, and she recoiled from it. 6 months after Simon's sentencing, Ellen asked for a separation. It wasn't angry, it was somber. "Mark," she said during a quiet Sunday afternoon, her voice thick with resignation, "you saved the company, and you saved our family financially, but you saved it alone. You kept me outside the wall. I don't know who you were for that year. I need a man who trusts me enough to be a partner in a crisis, not a subordinate in a plan." It was the truth, delivered without malice, the kind of surgical assessment I respected. Our divorce was quiet, mediated, and fair. There were no auditors, no accusations, just the acknowledgement of 2 people whose paths had diverged under duress. The cost of maintaining the moral high ground and professional integrity was the loss of the woman I loved, a painful irony that added a layer of complexity to my triumph. The years rolled on. At 62, I was a grandfather. Lily, now 26 and a civil rights attorney, had a daughter named Clara. Ethan, 23, was working on a PhD in computer science at MIT. My relationship with my children was the ballast that kept my ship steady. They knew the story of Simon Sterling, not as a tale of revenge, but as a lesson in ethics and accountability. Lily once asked me, "Dad, didn't you ever want to see him suffer? Didn't you want to gloat?" I was sitting in my living room, watching Clara toddle across the hardwood floor. I looked at Lily, my smart, fiercely moral daughter, and I gave her the most honest answer I had. I didn't want him to suffer, Lily. Suffering is temporary. I wanted him to face the predictable, logical consequences of his actions. I wanted him to see the numbers add up, and I wanted to ensure that the integrity of the system was restored. My vindication wasn't in his prison cell. It was in the fact that I got to keep this, I said, gesturing around the living room. And he lost everything he valued, which was his image and his access to money. That's not suffering. That's simply reality asserting itself. My career peaked at 65. I retired from Apex Global Solutions, having served a full term as Director of Global Operations. My replacement was a woman I had mentored, a meticulous data scientist who understood that the future of logistics was not in flashy rhetoric, but in accurate execution. My retirement party was held in the same auditorium where Simon Sterling had been arrested. Robert Vance gave the toast, holding up a framed photo of me standing on stage with Agent Miller. Mark Vance declared to the crowd of executives, vendors, and staff, "You didn't just save us $4.3 million. You taught us that the true cost of doing business is not the capital expenditure. It is the absolute commitment to the truth. You are the architect of our current success." I accepted the praise with quiet grace, knowing the real victory was private. Now, at 68, I live a life of peaceful, productive anonymity. I consult selectively for mid-sized logistics firms, advising them on risk management and fraud prevention. My retainer fees are high, not because of my title, but because of my track record. I moved from the big house in the suburbs, which Lily now owns, to a smaller, more manageable condo downtown. I drink good coffee, I read history books, and I watch my granddaughter grow. I haven't spoken to Sarah Jenkins, Robert Vance, or Elias Thorne in years. The case is closed. The experience is filed away under traumatic vindication, a necessary surgery that left me scarred but fundamentally healthier. The final rhetorical device, the echo, came unexpectedly in the form of a LinkedIn message sent to my profile 2 years ago when I was 66. It was from Simon Sterling. He had been released on parole after serving almost 4 years and had been working a non-managerial job in a fulfillment center, a cruel twist of fate that placed him in the very industry he had once ruled. His message was brief, a single paragraph that had clearly been crafted for maximum emotional impact. It was a plea for a job recommendation, a request for forgiveness, and a chance to get back into the game. He ended the note with the very same buzzword he had used to justify his crime and my termination. "I just need a chance to prove I can still bring some synergy to a lean operation." I read the message twice. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just the realization that the man had learned nothing. He still thought in buzzwords, not substance. I opened a new email to my assistant. "Block this sender," I wrote. "Do not reply. I will not engage." I closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked out over the city, the complex grid of traffic and movement below me. I had worked 15 years for a company. I had risked everything for a principle. I had been told I was redundant, a dinosaur whose vision no longer aligned with the future. I knew better now. I was the architect of the system. Simon Sterling was just a fatal flaw in the design. I had fixed the flaw, the structure was sound, and my life, quiet, contained, and honest, was the proof.